Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Assistant Manager of Visitor Experience here at the museum. Thank you again for joining us today, and welcome back to all of you who have been here before. This virtual series features programs on Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories about the trolley era and our collection that you can experience from the comfort of your home. And we're going to continue these programs regularly as long as I have presenters. So if you have a show that you'd like to share that fits the museum mission, please let me know. That'd be anything about Pennsylvania transportation, the trolley era, or cities where our trolleys come from. And if you have a program that doesn't quite fit those guidelines, feel free to reach out anyway, and we'll see what we can do. You can see a full list of upcoming presentations at our website, patrolley.org, which I will share in this chat box in just a few minutes here. And I want to extend a very, very special thank you to those of you who donated when registering for tonight's program, and those of you who have made donations throughout our website this year, or through our website this year. We truly appreciate your support of our virtual outreach programs and the museum. All right, so for those of you who might be new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Art and Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And the museum opened to visitors a few years later in 1963 and is actually located along the trolley line between former trolley line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. Here you'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars, about 20 of which operate, and around 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride here at the museum. And before we get started, if you haven't gotten your Western Pennsylvania trolley calendar this year or for 2023 yet, it is available at our website, patrolley.org. Again, click on it in the chat in just a few minutes when I share it. And the roof is being installed on the new Welcome and Education Center, and they have coffee, the depot along Trolley Street. There are lots of exciting things happening this fall at the museum. So if you'd like to support our capital campaign, visit patrolley.org/support. And to receive our newsletter on our website to latest updates on our new building. I just got a notification that my internet connection is unstable, so let me know if if I drop out here. This past weekend, we had our Pumpkin Patch Trolley event. We had over 1,100 visitors, and we are really looking forward to a new event, Trick or Trolley, this coming weekend, which is kind of a spin on Trunk or Treat. But instead of visiting trunks, children will visit trolleys to go trick-or-treating around the museum. And we're still looking for candy donations. So if you're one of our locals, feel free to stop by, drop off a bag of individually wrapped candy. And one last thing I wanted to let everybody know, especially for our Philadelphia fans, car 606, the Almond Joy car, was open to visitors for the first time in ages this past weekend. So thanks to our staff and volunteers who allowed this to happen. It's very exciting. All right, and now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Albert Churella. Albert Churella is a professor of history at Kennesaw State University, located in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. He's published 2 books, From Steam to Diesel, Managerial Customs and Organizational Capabilities in the 20th Century American Locomotive Industry, and The Pennsylvania Railroad, Volume 1, 1846 to 1917, Building an Empire. The second volume of his Pennsy history, The Age of Limits, 1917 to 1933, will be published by Indiana University Press with a scheduled release date of August 2023. The third and final volume, covering the years between 1933 and the Penn Central merger in 1968, will be available in the summer of 2024. Churella is also the president of the Lexington Group in Transportation History, an educational organization that seeks to promote a dialogue on railroad and transportation history and practice. Again, at the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session with our presenter, but the chat box will be open. So please feel free to enter questions and comments during the show, and we can read through those at the end. And just to note, this program is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube in hopefully the next couple weeks. So please keep your microphones muted, and we'll turn off our videos now during the presentation so that our presenter has no distractions and all the bandwidth available for the slideshow. I will invite you to turn those back on and unmute at the end. All right, Al, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And thank you for arranging all of this, for inviting me to speak to you. And thank you to everybody in the audience. I really appreciate you being here and spending the next hour or so listening to what I have to say about commuter rail service in Philadelphia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And you should, in just a moment, see the title slide of my presentation. And if you can't, just let Kristen know or type something in the chat box. I'll try to. Okay, wonderful. I have the chat box open. Sometimes I find it a bit distracting to give the presentation and monitor the chat, and I would like to keep things flowing. So if there's something that I see in the chat that's pertinent to a specific slide or a particular part of the presentation, I'll try to take a break and answer it, and Kristen will be monitoring it too, and she can break in if there's an especially pertinent question that really can't wait till the end. So some of you may have seen parts of this presentation. I did a similar talk for the Electric Railroaders Association some months ago. There is some new stuff in here as well. And for those of you who did hear that earlier presentation, I hope you don't mind hearing some of the old stuff again. I see that a number of you either live in Philadelphia or have lived in Philadelphia, have ridden commuter rail services in Philadelphia. So you certainly are familiar with that. I have some familiarity with it too. I went to college in Philadelphia, Haverford College to be precise, on the main line. So I, rode the Paoli Local under SEPTA for a number of years. The project that I'm working on, as Kristen pointed out, is this long and pretty extensive history of the Pennsylvania Railroad that originally was supposed to be a single volume. Now it's expanded to 3, and that will be the end of it all. And Kristen mentioned that volume 1 is published, volume 2 will be out next year, and volume 3 will be out about a year after that, summer of 2024. And what I'm talking about this evening is just really a very small part of that, actually mostly coming from the forthcoming 3rd volume of the series. And as a historian, of course, we have our sources, including a number of archives like the ones you see listed here. You're probably familiar with a number of these, particularly the Hagley Museum and Library and the Pennsylvania State Archives, their extraordinary repository of Pennsylvania Railroad records. But there are a number of others as well that featured into the books and also to the subject this evening. So if you have spent time in Philadelphia, you're familiar with maps like these. And one of the interesting things about Philadelphia is that for a city its size, it has a very poor rapid transit or subway elevated network, the one you see there on the left. Other cities, New York is an obvious example, have much more extensive subway systems. But for a city of its size, Philadelphia has a very extensive and really quite comprehensive commuter rail operation. And there are a number of reasons for that. I could give a separate talk on why the subway system faltered and everything, but it is one of the odd kind of dichotomies of transportation in Philadelphia, that the commuter service to the suburbs is really much more robust than the inner city subway and elevated rail lines. So that was one of the things that got me interested in this. And if we move on, and this is, of course, Center City, Philadelphia, looking more or less northeast, off to the kind of top right corner of the map is the Delaware River. To the bottom left is the Schuylkill. And what you see here, of course, are 3 railroad stations belonging to 2 different railroads. If you can see the cursor moving here, you probably recognize the train shed of Reading Terminal with the tracks, which are now becoming a kind of elevated linear park, recreational walkway. And then the Tower of City Hall here, William Penn statue. And this, of course, is Broad Street Station with Suburban Station located here, the tracks to which, of course, are underground. And then off to the left-hand side of the picture is 30th Street on the other side of the Schuylkill River. And the stations here then serve this really fairly extensive commuter rail network belonging to two railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading. And each came about really before there even were rail lines anywhere in the United States. So, for example, we can go back to look at the Schuylkill navigation in 1825, the canal and ponding network designed to bring anthracite down the Schuylkill River to Philadelphia. That, of course, gave rise to the Reading Railroad, Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, and its line along the Schuylkill River, and eventually a much more extensive network in and around the Philadelphia area. The other major carrier, the one that really supplanted the Reading in terms of pride of place in much of Pennsylvania, it dates back really to 1795, the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike Road, which is now Lancaster Avenue, or parts of it is now Lancaster Avenue, heading west out of Philadelphia. There's Paoli there, which traditionally has been the sort of end of commuter service on the main line, replaced by the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, which began service in 1832 as part of the state's main line of public works. And in 1857, it came under the control of the Pennsylvania Railroad and became their main line. And that's why, of course, the area is called the main line, capital M, capital L, because it was part originally of that main line of public works. And the Pennsylvania Railroad also operated an extensive network to the west of Philadelphia in particular. The map here shows some of the original tracks and how they were replaced. The kind of dotted line toward the top of the map is the original location of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, with the Fairmont Inclined Plane sort of in the top center of the map, and then replaced by the dashed line below it to eliminate the inclined plane. And I include this map because I've circled City Line Avenue, the outer western extremity of the city and county of Philadelphia, and traditionally where the commuter district then begins, and then on to stations like Ardmore, where the relocated main line joined the old main line. And again, a very extensive rail network. Not all these lines saw commuter service, of course, but most of those in the area right around Center City, Philadelphia did. And here, of course, is the main line from Overbrook, which literally is just over a brook that parallels City Line Avenue, west as far as Paoli. But of course, the commuter district has really, with suburban expansion, extended west from there. When we think of the main line, it's an iconic area. It's the epitome of the gracious lifestyle of sort of old money Philadelphia, although quite frankly, Chestnut Hill was in many respects a more desirable suburb, kind of to the north of Center City, for many, many years before the main line became a popular place for affluent Philadelphians to reside. It's an area that extends from Overbrook to Paoli. And it's an area that inspired all sorts of artistic interpretations. You may have read or heard of Kitty Foyle, Christopher Morley's novel, longtime Philadelphia writer, made into a movie starring Ginger Rogers and Dennis Morgan. And you've got to acknowledge that Christopher Morley had a sense of wry humor, because the character that Dennis Morgan plays is Winwood Strafford VI. The sixth, of course, is a reference to old money Philadelphia, but his first and last names are stations along the route of the Paoli Local. And perhaps even more famously, the Philadelphia Story in 1940, again, the epitome of gracious mainline living, starring Katharine Hepburn on the right, who, of course, was a Bryn Mawr College graduate, right smack dab along the middle of the main line. But it hadn't always been that way. In 1865, the Pennsylvania Railroad started local service to Paoli, but it was really not very convenient. According to the rather sort of bittersweet reminiscences of John W. Townsend, who's writing many years after the fact, the Pennsylvania Railroad did not cater much to commuters in the 60s, be the 1860s, of course. There are only 6 trains a day each way. If the 6 p.m. was missed, there was nothing till the emigrant train at midnight. It was unpleasantly odoriferous. There was naturally no going to the city for theaters, evening entertainments, or club attractions. That begins to change in 1868 when Pennsylvania Railroad engineers began planning to relocate some of the main line to straighten it, to ease curvature. And then as part of that process in 1870 and 1871, began building new stations. Including the one at Ardmore. But what really put the main line, as it were, on the map was that in 1869, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Board of Directors appointed a committee for the development of a, can't really even call it a community, it's a district with the rather uninspiring name of Humphreysville. And as part of that relocation, line relocation and development process, they chose evocative sounding names from many of the mainline communities. And for Humphreysville, they chose Bryn Mawr, part of the old Welsh tract. It seemed an appropriate name. And in 1871, I'm not exactly clear about the date, either 70 or 71, built the new station at Bryn Mawr that lasted well into the 20th century before, unfortunately, being torn down and replaced. And this is the area of Bryn Mawr. You'll notice the Bryn Mawr Hotel is located there. A number of lots located to the north of the tracks. Toward the bottom of the image is Lancaster Turnpike, today's Lancaster Avenue, the old Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike. The Bryn Mawr Hotel was called inaccurately one of the finest in the eastern United States. It really wasn't. It was a decent quality hotel, but nothing that can match the fine hostelries of cities like New York and Boston. But really, it became a suburb for the well-to-do. If you look at some of the deed restrictions, the stipulations that the development committee put on construction, you'll notice that improvements on Montgomery Avenue must be worth not less than $8,000. Upon other avenues, streets, and lanes of not less than $5,000. For comparison's sake, $8,000 in 1875 is about $215,000 in today's money. And I challenge anybody to buy a house in Bryn Mawr for that kind of money today. So it seems like a reasonable amount of money, but keep in mind the average daily wage in 1875 was $2.25. So clearly only the well-to-do could afford to live there. And to keep the community in, shall we say, have the proper respectability, it was forbidden to operate hotels, other than the Bryn Mawr Hotel, of course, taverns, saloons, blacksmith shops, carpenter shops, in other words, any kind of manufacturing. It was designed for homes for the well-to-do. Initially, not people who live there year-round, but often families would move there in the summer to get away from the heat and the noise and quite possibly the epidemic diseases of Philadelphia. And increasingly, the husband, the father, would go in to work in the center city. And so in addition to putting out promotional booklets, this one from 1875, the Pennsylvania Railroad offered monthly ticket rates between the various mainline stations and center city. And notice that one of the first stipulations of these monthly ticket books, these are commutation tickets. from which, of course, we get the phrase commuting or commuter. Now, we fast forward to the early 20th century, and by the early 20th century, Broad Street Station in Center City, which is a stub end terminal after all, is increasingly congested with local trains, commuter trains, long distance trains, all of which have to pull in, back out, reposition themselves. And one of the main goals of electrifying first the line to Paoli and ultimately all the commuter lines in the Philadelphia area is to eliminate as many backup moves as possible in Broad Street Station, because of course commuter equipment like these MP54 cars operate bidirectionally. They can be more easily positioned in and out of the station. So at a cost of $4 million by September of 1915, the Pennsylvania Railroad inaugurates electric service as far as Paoli. And that, of course, becomes the nucleus not only of widespread electrification of commuter routes in Philadelphia, but also using the same basic high voltage alternating current system to electrify the route between New York, Washington, and Harrisburg. And the Reading, at the same time, undertakes a similar electrification project in large part to alleviate congestion at Reading Terminal, just a short distance to the east. Now, by the 1930s, the Pennsylvania Railroad's commuter operations in Philadelphia are beginning to experience difficulties. And the same could be said of the Reading as well. Between 1930 and 1940, there's a 20% increase in suburban population, which you might think would benefit the Pennsylvania Railroad enormously, given that its trains serve the suburbs. It really doesn't, not as much as you might expect, in part because people are taking to their cars instead of to commuter trains, but also because of the Great Depression. Fewer people have jobs, fewer people are commuting or traveling by rail at all. On December the 11th, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, the federal government begins imposing restrictions on the sale of tires. In January of 1942, the War Production Board orders the termination of production of civilian automobiles for the duration of the war. A few months later, gasoline rationing, which is mainly an effort to conserve tires and rubber rather than gasoline. But obviously, this very much reduces the ability of people to drive anywhere. And so there is a huge increase in rail travel, particularly in the case here, commuter rail travel. But everybody knows it's temporary. In fact, Martin Clement, who at the time is president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, acknowledged that this was a temporary necessity, and after the emergency, that is the war, is over, it will be back to where it was. That is, we cannot count on this traffic for the long term. And Clement was right. The growth of suburbia after World War II didn't help the Pennsylvania Railroad at all. Levittown, for example, not the one on Long Island, but there's a second one north of Philadelphia along the route to Trenton, built out between 1952 and 1958, very close to the Pennsylvania Railroad main line to New York. But that and other suburbs didn't increase demand for commuter rail to any appreciable degree. As Clement pointed out in February of 1948, the type of commuter who is moving into Overbrook and Marion on the main line is not interested in that consideration which the service requires. In other words, what he is saying is the people want the convenience of the automobile, and they're not willing to put up with equipment that is largely outdated, worn out from the Second World War. And as Walter Patchell, the Pennsylvania Railroad's vice president of special services, pointed out a few years later, the public has abandoned the railroad before the railroad has been forced, as a result, to curtail or abandon service. And yeah, I see. Thank you for the comment about the mouse or the cursor. For whatever reason, my page up and page down isn't working, so I'm using the cursor to move it down, and I'll try to keep it very much off to the side as I do so. So the problems here. In 1946, the Pennsylvania Railroad carried 21 million commuters. By 1957, it's down by about a third to 14.3 million, thanks to additional cars, more highways. But the real problem is uneven demand distribution, not merely a decrease in demand year by year, but the fact that commuter operations are bimodal. There's a morning rush hour and evening rush hour, far less traffic during the middle of the day, and very little traffic on Saturdays and almost none at all on Sundays. And it's also very seasonal, as commuter rail demand is at its lowest point during the summer, when many people are on vacation and when many people prefer to drive their cars. And it's highest during the winter when the roads are icy and people prefer not to risk their automobiles and their necks on the highways. And so they begin then to take commuter rail. Now, to meet this demand with aging equipment that is by the 1950s, really 4 decades or more old, the Pennsylvania Railroad works with the Budd Company, and Budd executives are certainly anxious to sell commuter rail equipment to replace the rapidly disappearing market for inner city passenger cars. In 1958, the Pennsylvania Railroad buys a half a dozen of what are known as Pioneer 3 cars that last in service until 1990. They're a definite improvement. They have such things as, air conditioning, for example. But the Pennsylvania Railroad certainly is not willing to put any additional money into what they believe correctly is a chronically money-losing proposition. And what happens to turn things around has very little to do with what's going on with the Pennsylvania Railroad, but everything to do with massive political changes that are taking place, particularly at the local level in the city and county of Philadelphia, and at the federal level. Now, in the years following World War II, a number of young, very assertive Democratic politicians begin to push back against the longstanding and notoriously corrupt Republican political machine that has dominated Philadelphia politics for 75 years, just about. In 1951, they secure a new municipal charter, which, among other things, gives additional power to the mayor and to the city controller. In November 1951, in the elections that November, they gain control of city government. They launch a series of investigations that demonstrate widespread irregularities in the mismanagement of Philadelphia's city government. Several prominent city officials commit suicide, others go to prison, and the power of the Republican political machine is broken. And from that point on, Democrats have control over city government. In particular, the two individuals you see in the photo, Joseph Clark, the man on the left, who serves as mayor between 1952 and 56, and his very close friend and political ally, Richardson Dilworth, who is Clark's district attorney and prosecutes many of the individuals accused of malfeasance. And then he replaced Clark as mayor until he resigned in 1962 for an unsuccessful run at the at higher office. These are not typical Philadelphians. These are what some individuals have called silver spoon liberals. They are wealthy. Clark is from one of the oldest, most established investment banking houses in the city. In many ways, they are disconnected in terms of socioeconomic class with the people living and working in Philadelphia, and they're disconnected in terms of political affiliation with the largely Republican suburbs. And one of the things that Clark, Dilworth, and their allies want to do is to preserve the economic integrity and the urban fabric of Center City, Philadelphia, by ensuring that suburbanites can easily get into the city to work, to shop, to engage in recreation, to stem the ongoing decline of the city of Philadelphia that, quite frankly, has been underway since the 1920s. And to do that, Clark, Dilworth, and others in the city government try to entice the suburbs to cooperate, to forge better transportation links between the city and the suburb. And to that end, they arrange for the creation of the Urban Traffic and Transportation Board in December of 1953. 2 years later, the UTTB issues its kind of survey of the situation known as Plan and Program 1955. And while the members of UTTB are developing Plan and Program, they confront a very real example of the limitations associated with automobility. And that has to do with the partial opening of the Schuylkill Expressway in September of 1954. Now, the Schuylkill Expressway is being built basically as a connector from the Pennsylvania Turnpike into Center City, Philadelphia. And by 1954, construction crews have proceeded as far as City Line Avenue, the avenue that I had in that kind of oval some slides back. And what happened was when the expressway opened, it dumped all the traffic from the freeway onto City Line Avenue and surface streets, creating what the Philadelphia Inquirer called a grand slam traffic jam and a monumental snafu. And it became obvious that freeways were not a panacea, that there would have to be a better way to bring people into Center City, if for no other reason that there weren't enough parking spaces or surface streets to handle all the automobile traffic. And if you'll forgive me for the extended quotation, the comments many years after the fact of John Bodine, who was a very influential member of Philadelphia society and a member of the UTTB, he recalled that the UTTB was formed for two reasons, one of which was made public and one of which was sort of the secret agenda. The purpose, as I recall, as set forth in the ordinance, was to study traffic conditions in the city and see what could be done about them, they being admittedly in chaos. The secret agenda was to prove that the proposition that it would be far cheaper for the city to subsidize the commuting railroads than it would be to allow them to go into bankruptcy and be discontinued and forced to build sufficient numbers of lanes of expressway on which the people who would normally have commuted on railroads would go back and forth commuting by car. In other words, Bodine is saying, we have no great love for commuter rail service, but it's the least bad option. It's a cheaper method of getting people in and out of the city than it is to consider building additional freeways. As far as the question, I have no idea when the first use of Center City was. It goes back quite a while, but I don't know exactly when that first came about. And with the recommendation of members of the UTTB and with the support of municipal officials in the city and county of Philadelphia, they're contiguous, they're integrated, this same governance structure and everything. The city begins to support what they call Operation Northwest. along the Pennsylvania Railroad and Reading parallel commuter rail lines to Chestnut Hill, which, as it so happens, is where John Bodine lives. The service begins on October 26 of 1958. The city, from the public treasury, gives $113,000 to the Pennsylvania Railroad, $47,000 to the Reading. Everybody, municipal officials, Reading executives, Pennsylvania Railroad executives, emphasize this is not a subsidy. They never use the word subsidy. Why not? Well, think of the context. It's the Cold War. It's the Red Scare. There's a pervasive fear of communism. And so most people assume that government subsidies to private companies is a prelude to governmental takeover of the railroads, i.e. socialism. And that is the option that nobody ever puts on the table. So everybody's very careful not to call these payments subsidies. Instead, everybody associated with this emphasizes that what the city is doing is purchasing additional service, much the same way a commuter would buy a book of tickets. They're not subsidizing the railroad, they're buying a service on the railroad. And it is a start. Although I should point out in passing that in 1958, the Pennsylvania Railroad lost more than $4 million in its commuter rail operations. So clearly, this is a drop in the bucket. And Operation Northwest paid for cheaper fares, subsidized fares, to places like Chestnut Hill, the PRR station is here, as well as more frequent service, especially on Saturdays. It paid for the construction of park and ride lots to enable people to blend multiple modes of transportation. And it paid for connecting bus service to extend the reach of commuter rail farther and deeper into the suburbs. Operation Northwest was followed by an Operation Northeast, launched about a year later, involved the Reading line to Fox Chase. And obviously the great fanfare. And this is actually Mayor Clark standing in the center of the rear door of a Reading coach. And in the circle there, the Diamond Herald of the Reading, as well as the Herald of the PTC, the Philadelphia Transportation Company, Transit Company, indicating the cooperation between the two entities. The problem was it didn't work, or it worked, but not in the way railroad executives wanted it to. As Trains magazine pointed out in December of 1959, traffic was up and so were deficits. Because, of course, every commuter traveling on the Pennsylvania Railroad or the Reading is moving at a loss. And so thanks to Operation Northwest and Operation Northeast, ridership it grows by 15%, but the railroad's net earnings plunged 28%. As this is happening, and yeah, thank you, by the way, pointing out, yeah, it was Clark in the door, but it must not have been Mayor Clark. He would have been out of office at that time. The next iteration of a development plan for Philadelphia occurs in May of 1960, when the City Planning Commission, organized under the auspices of the city government, issues the comprehensive plan, the physical development plan for the city of Philadelphia. A long title for a fairly long document that is based on several woefully inaccurate assumptions. The most inaccurate, or the least accurate assumption, the biggest mistake they made, was to assume that Philadelphia's, the city of Philadelphia would grow in the future, that it would increase in population. It did not. It actually decreased in population and did for decades thereafter. The other mistaken assumption of many associated with the comprehensive plan was the notion that people living in the suburbs would always continue to go into Center City to work, to shop, for recreation, when in fact, during the 1960s and the 1970s, it was very clear that in the suburbs, people were working in the suburbs, they were shopping in the suburbs, and they were pursuing recreational activities in the suburbs and increasingly avoiding Center City. But it was based on the admittedly flawed assumptions of the comprehensive plan that the city begins to increase its commitment to commuter rail operations by organizing PSIC, the Passenger Service Improvement Corporation, the brainchild of city solicitor David Berger, who incorporates this entity in January of 1960. This is actually based on an earlier idea of Berger for a municipal economic development corporation. Berger is one of these young, aggressive sort of Philadelphia reformers. He's a veteran of World War II. He actually survives the sinking of the USS Hornet. He winds up in New Guinea, where he meets Marine Captain Dilworth. And the two of them commiserate on the political corruption that was at that time endemic in Philadelphia, and make a pledge that if they returned home alive, they would embrace reform and this kind of new political order. Now, what the Passenger Service Improvement Corporation is a corporate entity that is controlled by the city of Philadelphia. And the advantage that it offers is that it can legally own equipment. And so in addition to launching an advertising campaign touting the benefits of commuter service on the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading, PSIC then begins signing agreements with Reading and Pennsylvania Railroad officials for new equipment, designed largely by Edson Tennyson, city transit engineer, who has a wide range of experience with municipal transit operations. He works with Pennsylvania Railroad officials. There is disagreement about how this new equipment is going to be designed, how much space each commuter is going to have for seating, that kind of thing. But eventually the details are worked out. And PSIC in 1963 purchased 55 Silverliners, 38 for the Pennsylvania Railroad, 17 for the Reading. They had different railroad-specific nomenclatures there. But these cars are not owned by either railroad. They're owned by the city, although indirectly through the Passenger Service Improvement Corporation, and then leased at a nominal fee to the railroads in order to replace some of the aging existing commuter equipment. And even though what you see here are older MP54 cars, the new equipment, the Silverliners, and financial support from the Passenger Service Improvement Corporation enables an expansion of the operations, in this case, along the main line toward New York City, as far as Torresdale. In fact, it's called Operation Torresdale, which is inaugurated in October of 1960. And the real goal of all of this improved service was, of course, Levittown. Yet it stopped at Torresdale, not Levittown. And the reason the service could not continue to Levittown was because Levittown was outside of the city and county of Philadelphia. Torresdale was the last commuter stop in the city and county of Philadelphia. And because they are owned by the city through PSIC, the Silverliner cars can't leave city limits. The only way that that's going to be possible is if the suburbs are willing to cooperate. And you see from that set of figures at the top, in 1958, PSIC, the city of Philadelphia directly funded $160,000 for Operation Northwest. By 1961, through PSIC, the city is spending nearly 10 times that amount, and it's all coming out of municipal funds. And as John Bailey, who's PSIC's executive director, said, the city will have gone about as far as it can on its own. We have agreed to bear all that I feel Philadelphia can support vis-a-vis the suburbs. In other words, the city is broke. We cannot afford to pay for expanded commuter service outside the city limits. And David Berger pointed out, the problem goes beyond the city line. It is more than a local problem. It is a regional one or even a federal one. And Berger, like Bailey, is clearly thinking about how to transcend these lines on a map that subdivide all of these geographic areas into different cities, suburbs, and states. And the federal government then enters the picture, thanks in part to a concurrent series of events that affect the railroads all across the United States, including the so-called Eisenhower recession in 1957 and 1958, which is really the death blow to many Northeastern railroads. They never fully recover from this. They never bounce back. The situation is so bad that in January 1958, the Smathers Committee holds hearings in Congress about the railroad situation, endless pages of testimony and so forth. Doesn't really accomplish much except perhaps to highlight the seriousness of the problems facing the railroads. But that August, Congress passed the Transportation Act of 1958. And likewise, it didn't do much, but there was one provision in the Transportation Act that proved significant for commuter rail. And that is the Transportation Act of 1958 gave the Interstate Commerce Commission greater authority to approve the discontinuance of intrastate passenger trains, taking that authority out of the hands of state regulatory agencies. Now, it seems most likely that members of Congress envisioned that provision of the Transportation Act of 1958 as a mechanism to allow railroads to discontinue lightly used branch line passenger trains between obscure small towns out in the middle of nowhere. But the way it was written, railroad executives, Pennsylvania Railroad, Reading, New York Central, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, I mean, all of these railroads serve the East Coast. They immediately spotted that this provision would enable them to discontinue intrastate commuter trains. And they threatened to do so unless they got help from the government in some way, shape, or form. And that help is quick in coming, thanks in part to the auspices of the Department of Commerce and one of its more important sub-agencies, the Housing and Home Finance Agency, which was organized in 1947 and went out of business in 1965 when it was replaced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In 1960, John F. Kennedy very narrowly wins the presidential election. In fact, it's the closest popular vote in American presidential history up to that time. And he realizes that if he's going to win re-election in 1964, he is going to need all the votes he can get, particularly as the Democratic Party is being increasingly supportive of civil rights in the South and thereby alienating Southern Democrats. And so Kennedy wants to compensate for that by courting the northern suburban vote, to get northern suburban voters to switch parties, the Republicans to the Democrats. And to do that, of course, he's going to give them things that they will find useful. And so all of these come together in 1961 when Congress passed the 1961 Housing Act that provided for Housing and Home Finance Agency demonstration grants. Again, they're not called subsidies, they're called demonstration grants. And the fact that it's the Housing Act and administered by the Housing and Home Finance Agency indicate that Kennedy and others are seeing the problems facing commuter rail as not a transportation problem, but rather they're seeing it as an urban problem. That this is a way to sort of rebuild American cities. With the possibility of demonstration grants, that is free, it's not really free money. There are local matching funds, but the bulk of the money is, of course, going to come from Washington, not from the city of Philadelphia or the surrounding suburbs. But with the prospect of that money, the city and a number of suburban counties organized SEPACT, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Compact, in September of 1961. It includes the city and county of Philadelphia. Again, they're contiguous. Bucks County, which is where Levittown is located. Chester County, which is where Paoli is located. And Montgomery County, though not Delaware County. And we'll get to that in a minute. And SEPACT is really just a bucket. It is a repository that is legally able to accept money from the federal government and then distribute it to the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading in support of their commuter operations. And so in May of 1962, the HHFA provides a $2.9 million grant, the bulk of which goes to the city through PSIC, and other amounts go to Bucks County and to Montgomery County. And the organization of SEPACT and the HHFA demonstration grants now enables the Silverliner equipment to leave Philadelphia city limits and enables the city and the surrounding counties to expand their service. And so finally, in December of 1962, Operation Torresdale becomes Operation Levittown, and there's extraordinary publicity involving the extension of service to this large suburban community. Bands, bigwigs, beauty queens representing the city of Philadelphia and the county, indicating the level of city-county cooperation made possible by the HHFA demonstration grant. This is in Suburban Station, one of the Operation Levittown trains about to leave. And then extending outward. In other parts of the commuter network, Operation Southwest extends only as far as the rather obscure station at Angora. That begins in October of 1963. And what is initially called, rather disingenuously, Operation Mainline, and then it's quickly branded as Operation Bryn Mawr. The service starts in October of 1963, ends in October of 1964, just about exactly a year later. And like Operation Southwest, it goes to Bryn Mawr and no farther. And the reason is that Bryn Mawr is the last stop before the main line enters Delaware County. And in fact, that is the section of track that transits the kind of north eastern corner of Delaware County before heading to Chester County, which is where Paoli is located. So what's going on in Delaware County? Well, what's going on in Delaware County are the activities of two individuals who have both an economic motive and, quite frankly, an ideological motive for opposing the SEPACT support for these various commuter rail operations. Philadelphia Transportation Company, under the control of Albert Greenfield, which operates the trolley and surface trolley and bus lines. And Greenfield is up in arms because he accuses the CPAC subsidies, and that's quite frankly what they are, of poaching traffic from his company. And PSIC and CPAC officials are aware of that possibility. And so they consider, where is the increased ridership on commuter rail lines coming from? Is it coming from people who had already been riding the commuter rail lines before the support began? Is it coming, as Greenfield asserted, from the Philadelphia Transportation Company that is driving down his ridership, or is it coming from automobiles? Now, PSIC did a survey of that, and they concluded that ridership on the commuter rail lines was up. That was a fairly easy figure to measure. They concluded that ridership on the Philadelphia Transportation Company, streetcars and buses, was down. That was a fairly easy thing to measure, but they had no way of determining how many people were riding automobiles. And so the PSIC survey uncovered evidence that what was going on here was that people who filled out the survey lied, or at least they were misstating what was going on. Large numbers of survey respondents said that they had abandoned their automobiles in order to commute to work on the commuter rail lines. Exactly what John Bodine and other supporters of commuter rail wanted to happen. But privately, the PSIC officials who did the survey concluded that many of the people who said that did not actually own automobiles, but were too embarrassed to say so because it'd be branded as being poor. And what they were actually doing was leaving the PTC cars and buses in order to ride on commuter rail, but claiming that they had left their automobile at home. And so there was, as it turns out, ample reason for Albert Greenfield to say that PTC could carry its passengers absolutely free and throw in a morning cup of coffee if it received the same per passenger subsidy as do the PSIC railroads. So Greenfield was opposed to the subsidy, but his opposition was minor in comparison to Merritt Taylor Jr., who for 3 generations, his family controlled the Philadelphia Suburban Transportation Company, the Red Arrow lines, including, crucially, the Norristown high-speed line. That is the route to Norristown in the kind of whatever that is, pink or lavender color there, that goes through a large portion of Delaware County, more or less paralleling parts of the main line. And he had several allies in Delaware County, including John J. McClure, the Republican power broker in the area, and County Commissioner G. Robert Watkins, who in a meeting of the county commissioners said, "I never like to pay your taxes, and I hate to contribute 1 penny to the city of Philadelphia when we need it so badly out here." In other words, why should we here in Delaware County subsidize commuter service that benefits other counties in the city of Philadelphia? We need to keep our money at home where it belongs. And so David Berger and other municipal officials made the trek out to the suburbs, met with Watkins and the other 2 county commissioners. And this was a classic case of polar opposites. Watkins represented the suburbs. He favored highways. In fact, made money in part as a highway contractor. He was a staunch Republican. He started his career working in a shipyard. He was a Protestant, and the main line was, to a large extent, remains a resolutely Protestant part of the city. David Berger was from the city, city center. He favored railways. He was a Democrat. He graduated from Penn Law School, and he's Jewish. And so there was very, very little that these individuals had in common, and they did not get along well at all. And certainly, the Delaware County opponents of commuter rail use their connections to the news media, here suggesting that the city of Philadelphia is shoving the nose of the Pennsylvania Railroad Reading commuter camel into the tent of suburban tax revenues. The cost is only bound to increase. So what is the solution? Well, the solution effectively is to buy out the opposition. And that's ultimately what happens. As the intermediate step, the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth, the state legislature passed the Metropolitan Transportation Authorities Act in August of 1963 to establish SEPTA, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. Like CPACT, it was a reservoir for additional federal funding and then coordinating the distribution of that funding to all the entire Philadelphia suburban region. And ultimately, SEPTA bought out the PTC and the Red Arrow lines. That comes later. In the meantime, Congress in 1964 passed the Urban Mass Transportation Act. President Johnson signed it into law on July the 9th, 1964, provided for nationwide $374 million over 3 years, including in the first year, $10 million for demonstration grants. Again, it's not called a subsidy, it's called a demonstration grant. Philadelphia prepared its application even before the ink was dry in the bill, the day before actually, and they were, I believe, the second, Detroit was, I think, the first, the second city to get a demonstration grant under the auspices of the Urban Mass Transportation Act. And what that did was finally enable the creation of the new Paoli Local. On September 1st, 1965, SEPTA assumed sort of organizational control over the operations of PSIC and CPACT. And then the following February, Operation Mainline is resurrected and extended to Paoli. And so what you see here is the station at Paoli. It is a typical suburban scene, but what you may not appreciate from the photograph is just how diverse this scene actually is. So the tracks in the station belong to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Silver Liners belong to PSIC. They are the city's in-kind contribution to subsidized commuter rail service, matching county contributions, most of which actually come from the Commerce Department through HHFA and UMTA demonstration grants, and then the new regional transit agency of SEPTA is overseeing the operations of all of this. It's extraordinarily complicated and convoluted, but to a certain extent, it does work. So I'll finish by saying, look, how much is all this costing? In 1958, the city directly through Operation Northwest supported commuter rail to the extent of $160,000. By 1961, through PSIC, it's 10 times that amount. In 1962, the HHFA application is $2.9 million, with $930,000 from Philadelphia and $627,000 from the counties and matching funds. By 1966, the proposed SEPTA budget is nearly $500 million over 10 years, including $168.9 million for commuter rail, roughly 1,000 times what the 1958 support had been, suggesting that possibly efforts to prevent expenditures on an expanding highway network were successful only because of massive expenditures on an expanded commuter rail service. It's not enough. The MP54 cars remain in service as late as 1981, just before I arrived in Philadelphia. SEPTA remains, like many transit agencies, chronically underfunded. But to bring things a little bit closer to home in Pittsburgh, this map suggests or shows the extent of commuter operations offered by the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. None of it exists anymore. At the same time that Philadelphians were, in their haphazard and kind of ad hoc way, trying to save commuter rail, civic officials in Pittsburgh said, let it go. The highways are a future, and all of that is gone. Yet, and for all its imperfections, SEPTA remains in service. So thank you very much for listening. I know it's actually 6 minutes past our time. I apologize for that. But if there are any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. I'll answer them directly. Kristen can talk to me about them. And she may unmute people. I'm not sure how she wants to handle that. So.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Al. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions here in just a second, but before we get to that, I did want to let everybody know that we've got a couple other programs coming up before the end of the year. We have November 9th, the Ohio Electric Railway presented by Bill Van Doren. And December 7th, we'll have another Philadelphia themed presentation about the subway surface trolley lines from Matt Non and Harry Donahue. And then we actually should have another Philadelphia themed presentation coming up early next year from Steve Berry about the Super Saturday Streetcar Special. So we're getting that on the schedule here shortly. But I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Your donation of any amount will help support the museum. And especially thanks to those of you who did donate during the registration process today. I will put a link to the support page in the chat in just a minute here. But in the meantime, we're getting lots of nice comments coming in through the chat. And I'm going to let everybody unmute themselves here, allow participants to unmute themselves. So if you have a question or a comment that you would like to pose directly, feel free to unmute yourself now. I'm trying to keep up with all the comments in the chat here.
Yeah, several questions about the Reading, and I must confess, I'm a partisan of the Pennsylvania Railroad, so I know just enough about the Reading to be dangerous, I guess. But I can't really tell you too much about the history of, when the older commuter equipment went out of service or any of that kind of thing.
Any questions for Dr. Churella?
Could I ask a couple questions?
Go ahead.
Okay. Rich Allman here. Al, thank you very much. A terrific presentation. One thing, comment a little bit about the role of Albert Cassatt. He was Alexander Cassatt. He was an important figure in the development of the commuter thing. Also, in keeping with the mission of PTM, he absolutely despised the trolley systems, even though, in many ways he was a visionary. He built the Hudson tubes, but because of where he lived in Lower Merion Township, he made sure that trolleys never ran on Montgomery Avenue, which was much more developed than some of the other places. And I think he was instrumental in the odd gauge that Pennsylvania trolley systems had. So that's one thing. If you could say something about Cassatt. And the other is, look into your crystal ball. Tell us what you see for the future of the commuter rail system.
Okay, well, thank you, Rich. I appreciate that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Cassatt and there, I think, were two things going on. Number one, he and his mainline neighbors wanted their community to be sort of isolated from the outside world, from the ordinary people, basically. And that's one reason he didn't want trolley service, in the area. But you're absolutely right. He really viewed the trolley service as maybe not a direct competitor to the Pennsylvania Railroad, but as a nuisance. And there are several issues going on. You may be familiar with the arcade building, which is across just to the south. It's across the street to the south from Broad Street Station, or where Broad Street Station used to be. And there was a covered walkway that connected the two, basically, I don't know, 15 feet above street level or something.
Mhm.
Bridge of
Um,
size. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were numerous proposals to build an elevated railway line, an L, through there, and Cassatt blocked it, mainly because he heard from a lot of merchants who didn't want the elevated in front of their stores and buildings, and he was able to block construction by the simple fact that he had the rights to maintain that overhead walkway. You know, that could have been torn down in a matter of hours, but he just would not permit that to happen, which kicked off the long saga of eventually putting the tracks underground and so on. And there's another story about the same time that there was criticism, really from muckraking journalists at the Philadelphia North American, who basically said Philadelphia is being bypassed. Because even though 30th Street Station did not yet exist, there was a station in more or less the same location in West Philadelphia, and a fair number of north-south through trains, that is from New York to Washington, were stopping there rather than backing into Broad Street Station. And then a number of east-west trains, including the most important east-west trains, were from New York to Chicago and St. Louis, were also bypassing Center City to use the North Philadelphia station. And so the North American basically said, Cassatt is forcing Philadelphians to ride on, you know, miserable, cold in the wintertime streetcars from Center City either to North Philadelphia or to West Philadelphia to board a train. It was a ridiculous allegation because at that time, the Pennsylvania Railroad had plenty of trains from Center City, Philadelphia, from Broad Street Station to Washington, to New York, to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to St. Louis, all those things. And there was no reason for other trains to back in and out of the station. But it was that attack that really exacerbated Cassatt's anger toward the streetcar lines as well. So yeah, he did not have any patience with them. Oh, the future. Sorry, the second part of your question. Interesting. Yes. I don't know. I haven't really kept up with SEPTA. I mean, there have been, you know, many stories about underfunding and mismanagement and so on, and I really can't speak to that. But until 3 years ago, I guess I would have said, I think that in large cities like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and so forth, commuter rail has got a bright future. But of course, that was pre-COVID and before people started increasingly working from home and so forth. So, you know, I don't know exactly when ridership, say in New York and so on, is going to get back to pre-pandemic levels. I'm not sure either that there is the, you know, kind of political consensus that there was in the 1950s and 60s to inject, you know, large amounts of public money into rebuilding commuter rail or subway systems or what have you. But in large cities, I mean, commuter rail is indispensable, and it's going to have to, you know, there's going to be more and more reliance on that in the future, I think. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my
Well,
sense of it.
it kind of feels to me what's happening is Einstein's definition of madness: keep doing the same thing, run a early 20th century operation and expect a different result. You know, there are a lot of things that could make, you know, shorter trains, more frequent service, more high platform level boarding, which could speed things up a lot. An integrated fare
Right.
system with the rest of SEPTA.
Yeah, and you know, but to get back to some of the comments in the presentation, Philadelphia cannot afford to do that. The state of Pennsylvania can't afford to do that. The money's got to come really from the federal government. And if you look at how many senators and how many members of the House of Representatives are from parts of the country that have no commuter rail operations whatsoever, it's very difficult for those individuals to go back to their home districts and say, you know, I voted in favor of a massive package of aid that will never benefit anybody here, but will subsidize people living in New York or Boston, or Philadelphia, or what have you. It's a very difficult sell politically.
Good. Thank you.
Two things that I noticed that I remember the motormen for the, I guess it might have been the P-54s and the Pioneers, that they would have the long trains for rush hour, and then during the day they were dragging the cars instead of dropping them off. They were dragging them, so there was wear and tear on the cars that they really didn't. And the other thing is we're seeing the Westchester line so slowly come back to life again. It's now stretched out to Wawa, and it'll probably be going up to Westchester, I imagine, next few years.
Yeah, that is an encouraging sign for the future. You know, Amtrak actually does much the same thing. I've ridden the Crescent multiple times in Atlanta and the Northeast, and every time I'm on there, the consist is exactly the same. 4 coaches, an Amfleet 2 lounge, a diner, 2 sleepers, a baggage car. That's, I mean, irrespective of demand. And so there are certain economies to keeping the set of equipment intact. And I think especially when the unions were much stronger than they are today, the cost to have a crew switch out half the cars or whatever, I guess the people at the railroads figured that cost was higher
Yeah.
than whatever wear and tear might
Yeah.
have occurred on the cars, just, you know, moving empty equipment back and forth.
One thing I did notice, a house I had before I'm living in now, backed right up to the New York Washington main line, and it was amazing to watch the trains shrink in a number of cars. And then I guess because of the airline problem, the trains have now gotten pretty lengthy. And one friend of mine that worked for the Amtrak said it was the only line that makes any money.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is, you know, there's a long discussion which is worthy of an extended presentation on its own about what is involved in making money in terms of passenger rail service.
Mhm.
And quite simply, no passenger rail service in the world makes a profit. I think,
Yeah.
you know, most people are aware of that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are infatuated with above the rails operating costs, and certainly in the Northeast Corridor, probably in the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak makes a healthy profit in terms of above the rails operating costs.
Yeah.
But when you factor in the infrastructure costs, you know, the fixed costs, even in the Northeast Corridor, it's highly unlikely that Amtrak is making what a, you know, a you know, private for-profit business would call a
Yeah.
profit.
I read somewhere that there's now more commuting out of the city than to the city. Another reverse commuting. Have you heard that?
I was not aware of that statistic, but it would not surprise me. Yeah, Philadelphia, and I'd have to double check to make sure I'm not giving anybody incorrect information. But I think in the 2010 decade, I may be wrong about this, that the city of Philadelphia actually increased in population rather than decreased. And if that's true, that's a you know, a remarkable development. So yeah, it's entirely possible that there are people, you know, living in Center City and who do commute out.
I think Wilmington is a morning destination.
Yeah, makes sense.
And Trenton, but that's odd because a lot of that is people transferring the trains to New York.
At what point did the connection between the Reading and the Pennsylvania lines occur?
19, I'm going to say 1985.
1984.
Yeah, 1984. Yeah, November 84. And by the way, if you look at all the funding for SEPTA, their big ticket item even then was the dream of connecting the PRR and Reading lines in the center of Philadelphia.
First,
So
the first day of operation was September the 8th, 1984.
Okay.
No, that was the
84,
first day. That was the first day to Market East. The first day through the tunnel connecting to the Reading was in November.
Yeah. Then they tried to phase the routes beyond that.
Yeah, it was a long-standing dream, and in fact, if you go back to the late 19th century, if you remember that aerial photo I showed with all three stations in it, looking more or less northeast, at the time, Samuel Ray was given the job of basically determining the feasibility of a rail route underneath Philadelphia to connect with the sort of stub end in Kensington of the old Philadelphia and Trenton line. And it would have followed more or less the angle of your view in that photograph. And it obviously never came to fruition. And, but the experience that Ray got with that, he put to good use in New York City, of course. But I mean, the notion of like tunneling through the city goes back that far. And the notion of connecting the Pennsylvania Railroad and Reading lines it goes back, easily into the 1950s.
Great. Any other questions or comments for Al?
Well, I got two other notes, if I could. One is you wanted to know about the blue liners on the Reading. The last service was in March of 1991. Okay, now you got that. The other thing is according to his survivor's cousins, Alexander's last name is pronounced Cassett, not Cassat. Cassat was his sister Mary. So please correct that.
Tomato, tomato.
No, it means they're serious about that. They hate it when he's called Alex Cassat. That's not as pronounced. It's Cassett. Cassett. It's a flat A right next to the C. Okay, please.
Yeah, I've heard that from other sources
That's
as well.
his
So,
survivor cousin. They get ticked off about that.
Let me say that the presentation was much better than I thought it was going to be. Very, very good.
Thank you.
Come on, Ray,
I
you knew it would be
appreciate
great.
that. Well, one of the best compliments I've received is from people who say, I read your books and you don't write like a historian. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you don't write like an academic. That's what they say. You don't write like an academic. I said, I appreciate that. I'll take that as a compliment. I like that. So
I'll be looking for your books.
I'm sorry.
I'll be looking for your books.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I need the royalties. Absolutely. Yeah, please. Well, the first one's out of print. The steam to diesel, they're scarcer than hen's teeth. But yeah.
There'll be one on eBay somewhere.
Yeah, but I've seen them for like $1,200 a piece. So you can get anything you want if you shell out enough money.
Yeah.
But it's a good book, but I don't know if it's that good.
Yeah. Well, Professor, I'm a SEPTA fan, even though I live out here in Pittsburgh, and this is the most comprehensive history of the rail system that I have heard. I thought it was utterly fantastic. One of the only things I knew about was the corruption in Philadelphia, because the streetcar lines and the building of the Market Street line also endured a lot of corruption.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was
very just absolutely fantastic, and he put a lot of things in order, in a straight line for me.
Yeah, I mean, the whole story of the streetcar corruption is extraordinary, and even as late as the 1920s, they were carrying on their books assets in the form of hundreds of horses. Obviously, since the 1880s, the lines have been, or in 1890s, the lines have been electrified, but they still kept the horses on the books. I mean, the horses were, turned into glue long before then, but the book said that
the big developer of the Philadelphia streetcars, Widener, went down on the Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I didn't know they still carried the. Out here in Pittsburgh, I don't have access to that information. That's certainly funny.
Well, even
Great.
the Hog Island shipyard was full of corruption during the First World War, so it's normal.
Yeah. Well, both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh carried over 200 or almost 200 underliers. I know
Yes.
Philadelphia got rid of their underliers and emerged as PTC about 1939 or 40, I
Yeah.
think 40. But I found an article on newspapers about one of the bigger lines out here in Pittsburgh, the Monongahela Street Railway. And it was talking about a line that owned nothing, ran nothing and collected lots of money every year. And this would go on till about 1950 out here. So at least Philly cleaned up their act.
All righty. Do we have any other questions about the presentation or comments about it?
Good show.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Question
All
about
right.
volume 2, August of next year. So
All righty.
volume 2 of the
Thank you very
Pennsylvania
much.
Register. So
Oh,
Thank
perfect.
you. Well done.
All
thank you so much,
righty.
everybody.
Well,
Have a
thank
good
you
evening.
again
Thank you.
very much. Yeah. Have a great night. And thanks to those of you who donated. We'll see you again in a couple weeks. Have a great
Okay.
night.
Good
Feel
night.
better, Chris.